You need me, or you're nothing. Because we're just alike, you and I.
Except you're boring. You're on the side of the angels.
What would I do without you? Go back to ripping off mob dealers? No. No, you complete me.
I'm actually working on a longer video at the moment, so this one is going to be a bit shorter and also a bit more informal. I don't have a very strict script. So we're going to be taking a look back at BBC Sherlock, the TV show that ran from 2010 to 2017, and mainly at the villain in Sherlock, which is Moriarty. Moriarty is Irish, canonically, at least in the TV show, and that's what I'm going to use as a kind of a jumping off point for this discussion. What I also want to look at are the origins of this kind of villain, which I think stems directly from the 2008 The Dark Knight, with Heath Ledger's iconic performance as the Joker. So Moriarty is the central villain in Sherlock. Although he is very important to the story, he doesn't actually appear much in terms of screen time and in terms of how much he interacts with the other characters. He first comes in the third episode of the first season. Each season of Sherlock had 3 episodes, with the exception of season 3, which had a special episode as well. And when Moriarty first appears, he kind of tests Sherlock by setting him basically a series of challenges with a sensitive time frame. So if Sherlock can't solve these mysteries in time, the person who is being threatened by Moriarty at that time will die. So Sherlock has a kind of a death on his hands. So straight away we see Moriarty is kind of messing with Sherlock's moral code, trying to force him into these very stressful situations. It all culminates with a scene in the swimming pool where Moriarty has strapped a bomb to Watson, Sherlock's colleague and friend, and basically threatens Watson's life. The series ends on a cliffhanger, and then when we come right back into the same narrative in season 2, Moriarty is suddenly called off by a mysterious phone call. We later learn that phone call is from Irene Adler, who turns out to be the central villain of the first episode of season 2. Moriarty indirectly influences events, but doesn't really appear again until the third episode of season 2, which is where he really plays the most important role that he does for the rest of the series. I would also argue that this is the best episode in all of Sherlock, because I think it's an episode that has some real stakes and consequences, though later on in the show a lot of this was undermined. Moriarty basically stages a very elaborate theft of the Bank of England, of several other very important English institutions, A, just to prove how much he can do, and B, to advertise his skills to international criminals. Even though Moriarty at this point is already a very established organised criminal with a strong network, he seems to want to expand further, and so this is partly his motivation. So far so good. We have a villain who has a clear motivation. We also have a villain who is threatening to the protagonist because he pressures Sherlock into making choices, as we see in the climax of this episode. One of Moriarty's more elaborate schemes also involves blackening Sherlock's name. So Moriarty ends up kidnapping these children, and then once Sherlock solves a crime, he's put in a position where he can actually be framed for it. Part of Sherlock's weakness that Moriarty is targeting here is Sherlock's ego and his desire to show that he can solve a case, to show how brilliant he is. Unfortunately, once we get to the final scene of this episode, where Moriarty kills himself in order to kind of prove a point to Sherlock, I think it all starts to fall apart, because really what's at stake now is Sherlock's friendship with Watson. And whereas the central struggle that we saw for most of the episode wasn't Sherlock's desire, to protect his friend, but more so it was, as we saw, his desire to be the one to solve the case, his ego. The main weakness that's being targeted by Moriarty is not really consistent. Is it Watson, or is it Sherlock's ego, or is it both? So another big issue with Moriarty in the Sherlock series kind of becomes more evident from this point on, because after he kills himself, There's really nothing more for the character to do, but he keeps appearing in subsequent episodes, either in flashbacks or, through various traps that Moriarty set before his death to basically to intimidate Sherlock and Watson and to make them think that he's come back to life. And this was also a kind of trick that was being played on the audience, because obviously the Sherlock creators really wanted people to come back and keep watching. So they kept teasing Moriarty throughout the rest of the season, the series in general. An issue with this, I think, is well illustrated in the episode The Abominable Bride, which is the special episode of season 3, which, as a kind of a gimmick, is set back in the 1890s, which was the original setting of the Sherlock Holmes stories.
Part of the impulse came from me and Mark saying, would it be a shame if we never got to see them do it in the authentic setting?
So I think this was mainly an excuse to get all the characters in costume and to kind of market this very special episode. I only watched it recently myself for the first time. I was honestly shocked at how bad it was. The mystery that it sets up is quite intriguing at first. You have this bride who's seemingly killed, and then she comes back from the dead to kill her husband. And there's witnesses, so it's all very intriguing, and you're wondering, wow, how did she pull this off? But of course, it's all just Sherlock in his mind palace trying to solve a problem, and really the problem is Moriarty. Moriarty just comes into the story even when it doesn't make sense for him to be there. In this way, he's often used as a plot device by the writers. This also has some things in common with the original villain in the stories by Arthur Conan Doyle. But I think it doesn't work the way that they do it in the show, because Sherlock Holmes' stories are supposed to be standalone mysteries, and each mystery is solved in the course of the story, and part of the thrill is kind of solving the mystery alongside him through the eyes of Watson, who is the kind of the audience surrogate. He's the very ordinary friend of Sherlock who kind of witnesses all this with wonder and admiration. I think the problem with the way Moriarty is a plot device in the TV show, it really contradicts this aspect of Sherlock, which clearly they still wanted to keep in the TV show, because in each episode we see the characters trying to solve a standalone mystery, but it just always seems to end up to be Moriarty behind the mystery, or else the mystery is just abandoned, or else it's solved in a way that's really not thrilling to the audience, because oftentimes it's so out there and bizarre that there's no way you could have possibly guessed that was going to happen. So as I already said, Moriarty's Irishness is really more incidental in the show. I don't think it really changes his character that much. And you could even argue that it's canonical in the original stories because Moriarty is an Irish name. But I think that the casting of Andrew Scott was very deliberate in this way. I know that the creators said before that they really wanted a Moriarty who was a departure from the other iterations of the character, whom they found to be too posh and too dull. Now, personally, I think this is quite funny because Andrew Scott, as Moriarty, has an incredibly posh accent.
Now you're in my way.
Thank you.
Didn't mean it as a compliment.
Yes, you did.
Yeah, okay, I did. But the flirting's over, Sherlock. Daddy's had enough now.
Any Irish viewer would instantly recognise his accent as being the most posh accent in Ireland, which is the South Dublin accent. So I think it's funny. I mean, obviously the English creators didn't pick up on this, and why would they? I think it's kind of an example of how messy Moriarty is, because even his Irishness itself is kind of inconsistent. The little backstory that we do get to Moriarty is in the first episode where he's introduced, which is the third episode of the first season. And we learn that as a teenager, Moriarty ended up killing this schoolmate of his because the schoolmate made fun of him. And this was in London. So I think he was something like 13 or something. But the problem I have with that is if Moriarty grew up in London, and he was going to school in London at least from the age of 13, and now he's in his 30s or something, and he's still speaking with a very strong Dublin accent, I don't know, it kind of bothers me a bit. Then again, it's not a major problem. I think it's possible, but I doubt that the writers really put that much thought into it, and I think that's partly my issue, which is that he's such a messy, inconsistent character. But more so than Moriarty's Irishness being kind of inconsistent, I just think that In general, he's messy in the same way that the show is messy. And there have been plenty of retrospectives on Sherlock, so I won't go into that too much. But I do think that it's true to say that a villain is really only as good as the protagonist that they're facing off against. That's not to say that the protagonist has to be a spectacularly written character, but I think that the bad characters, the villains, have to be internally consistent with the world and with the characters. And I think that Sherlock's Moriarty is someone who doesn't really seem to have any logic to his actions, and whose motivations are unclear or constantly changing.
Upset the established order, and everything becomes chaos. I'm an agent of chaos.
Okay, so I have a confession to make. I don't really like The Dark Knight. It's really just not my kind of movie. I actually, in order to make this video, I rewatched it, and I struggled so much with that because I didn't seem to be able to just sit down for 2.5 hours and watch it. I kind of watched it in bits and pieces. What struck me rewatching it was that a lot of Heath Ledger's performance in the original movie and how that then became this legacy. I think people really focused a lot on the physicality of his performance, and I think on the, let's say, the more obvious elements of his performance. He's very kind of hammy in a sense, but it works, but he's very out there. But there's one scene in particular that I think I always remembered to be like the most central scene to his character, which is the one where he storms into the party to disrupt, Bruce Wayne. Sorry, I forgot Batman's name for a minute.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are tonight's entertainment.
Yeah, that scene is important, and it shows the way that people react to the Joker, and that's important in its own way. What really came across to me when I rewatched the movie was how elaborate the Joker's plan is. I think that a lot of the important stuff he does is actually off screen. For example, in the midpoint of the film, when Rachel, Batman's love interest, is killed, it's because the Joker has switched the addresses. So basically the address that he told Batman to go to, where he would find Rachel, was actually the address where he found Harvey Dent. And he did this in order to kind of basically prove to Batman that he wasn't as noble as he thought he was, because instead of saving Harvey Dent, who is the symbol of goodness in the city, Batman chose to be more selfish and to save his childhood sweetheart. I really like that because, we do see Joker giving him the addresses in the scene, but we don't actually learn, obviously, until Rachel is killed, we don't learn what Joker has done behind the scenes. And there's a lot of other aspects, a lot of other examples in the movie of him doing this kind of thing. We don't get a backstory for Joker, and that's very deliberate. We just get a series of conflicting backstories, which are clearly just lies made up by the character in the moment. But I think it works because he's a very dynamic character, and what we do see of him, from that we can infer that this is someone who's very dedicated to his work, who has been working for a long time in order to gain this criminal network that he has, in order to gain all these resources that he has. I really like how at the start of the movie, the Joker is already known to everyone. Like we see that Batman has already come across him before, but that they've all just kind of underestimated him as, the latest kind of freak.
Him again. Who are the others?
Another bunch of small-timers.
It was probably inevitable, especially given Heath Ledger's death, that this performance became so iconic, and not to take away at all from the actor's skill, because I think that it is an amazing performance. But I think that, we didn't really see anything else like it. And so when we saw those kind of imitations, especially Raul Silva in Skyfall, and Moriarty, I think, is really, really influenced by this, by the success of the Joker. I just think it doesn't work in the same way, because we see a lot of the similar aspects to the Joker's character where, for instance, he's not afraid of dying. We inherently find a villain who is not afraid of death terrifying, because death is such a human fear.
You have nothing to threaten me with. Nothing to do with all your strength.
You can have me arrested. You can torture me. You can do anything you like with me. But nothing's going to prevent them from pulling the trigger.
It's not as effective because at least the Joker in The Dark Knight, whenever he does face his own death, we see that he's not afraid, but he doesn't do it randomly. He doesn't just put himself in harm's way unless there is going to be a direct consequence. And the consequence that he's hoping for in these cases is to corrupt the other characters. He wants to corrupt Batman by making him be the one who kills him. He wants to corrupt Harvey Dent and manages to succeed to do that. And as we see in the film, he's not all-seeing or all-knowing. He makes mistakes, and he also learns as he goes. Like we see, for example, in the party scene, that when he observes Batman saving Rachel, that's when he makes the decision to use her in order to get to Batman. As we see later on in the film, the Joker's plan to pit the two fairies against each other ends up failing. He basically sets up a bomb, gives two different fairies a detonator. So on one ferry is a group of criminals who are being transported, and on the other ferry is a group of, Gotham's civilians. And his plan ends up failing because neither of the ships decide to blow each other up. But even when his plan fails, we see that Joker has a backup, because even if he can't corrupt the citizens of Gotham, he still has Harvey Dent, who is this symbol of goodness and purity. Whereas the differences in Sherlock, Sherlock has multiple weaknesses that Moriarty could exploit. He has his friendship with Watson, but also his own ego. And in a similar way, Batman in The Dark Knight has Rachel, but he also has his own desire to do good. His belief in Harvey Dent, his belief in the goodness of other people, but also his belief in his own righteousness. But these weaknesses of Batman are inherently related. Batman's belief in Harvey Dent conflicts with his relationship with Rachel, since Rachel is in a relationship with Harvey Dent.
Moriarty in the book, in the story, is a grave professorial man.
Yeah.
His shoulders stooped through much study and all these things, and we knew we weren't going to do that.
So what's interesting about Professor Moriarty in the original Sherlock Holmes stories is that he was also a plot device. But as we're going to see, not in the same way that show Moriarty was a plot device. So the Sherlock Holmes stories were written between the 1880s and the 1920s by Arthur Conan Doyle. In total, there are 56 short stories and 4 novels. And they're all told through the point of view of Watson, of Dr. Watson, who is the kind of everyman character.
I'm blessed if I know why on earth you want all these clippings about this Baskerville fellow.
I've an idea, Watson, that young Sir Henry isn't destined for a very long existence in this world.
What?
My conjecture is that he'll be murdered.
Murdered?
When Arthur Conan Doyle kind of got tired of writing the Sherlock stories, he decided to kill Sherlock off, and in order to do that, he invented the character of Moriarty. So we see in the story the final problem. Sherlock has kind of been pursued for a while by this criminal mastermind, the person whom he describes as the Napoleon of Crime. He's an exceptionally well-connected man who also kind of has this double life because he's also a successful professor. And so he's, the kind of person who nobody would suspect of being this incredible, well-connected criminal. We see a confrontation between Sherlock and Moriarty where Moriarty comes to Sherlock's lodgings. We also see this in the TV show. And the conversation plays out in a pretty similar way in both iterations. Moriarty basically tells Sherlock that he's tired of having his schemes, thwarted by Sherlock the whole time. So you get the sense in the Conan Doyle stories that a lot of the crimes that Sherlock has been solving in these standalone stories, it did end up indirectly affecting Moriarty because he has this criminal network. As opposed to in the show where Moriarty is kind of playing this elaborate game with Sherlock and basically creating these mysteries for Sherlock to solve. So in the stories, it's true that Moriarty is also a plot device, but he seems like a more solid threat because he follows Sherlock and Watson across Europe and ends up being able to kill Sherlock through use of various disguises and through use of his criminal network. He fits in with the logic of the world. What he does is inherently logical, maybe too logical in the view of the Sherlock showrunners who really wanted a more interesting villain. In the Guy Ritchie movies, Moriarty is a lot closer to the original Moriarty in the stories. And it's true that he's not like quite as interesting to watch as Andrew Scott's Moriarty. But I'd say that Sherlock in these movies is a lot more fun. He's a lot more chaotic. We really see him, for example, using disguises, which we never really see in the BBC show, because obviously they thought it would be a bit silly. So it didn't really matter that we had a more dull villain, as Moriarty, because they complemented each other well. Of course, in the BBC Sherlock, I wouldn't say that Benedict Cumberbatch's performance as Sherlock is dull either. My main problem with it really is the writers didn't really seem to know what they wanted to do with Sherlock half the time. They kind of swing between criticising how misanthropic he is, but then also rewarding him for being misanthropic.
You always say such horrible things. Every time. Always.
Sentiment is a chemical defect found in the losing side.
Sentiment? What are you talking about?
You.
The fact that Moriarty in the stories is, has more ties with organised crime, I think is a product of the anxieties of the time. Conan Doyle apparently based Moriarty on this criminal called Adam Worth, who was similarly very well connected and whose name itself was quite mysterious in the same way that Moriarty was. Moriarty in the show is more closely aligned with terrorism, similarly to how we see Heath Ledger's Joker is also kind of playing into these fears around terrorism, which is obviously a result of the 9/11 attacks. What I find interesting about all this is that it makes you realise really how little you need for a good villain. When I watch The Dark Knight, okay, it's not my cup of tea, but I can't deny that this is a very effective villain. The Joker, he's threatening, he's also intriguing, and I would have said before that, the key to a good villain is that you need to sympathise with them. But I don't think that's necessarily true, because at no point in the film do I feel connected to the Joker in that way, because he's missing an essentially human quality. He doesn't have any empathy. And yet, I find him intriguing. And I think this has to do with his motivation. We enjoy stories about people who are good at what they do, which I think is so interesting. It's that we don't necessarily enjoy stories about good people all the time. As long as the people are good at what they do, that's what we connect with. Why is that? Well, I think it has to do with this motivation. If the characters that we're following are highly motivated, the plot is more thrilling and more engaging. We could see some good examples of this in a lot of the TV shows that have been really successful over the last 20 years. I think that this is the key behind the Joker's success in The Dark Knight. He's motivated. What is this motivation?
Some men just want to watch the world burn.
My reading of it is that even though we're not given a backstory for him, he's a person who has been broken by the system. He is someone who has lost faith and who has lost hope. And he has this kind of rage, which he directs into this very elaborate plan, which, as we see, probably took years to build up.
This city just showed you that it's full of people ready to believe in good. Until their spirit breaks completely.
A lot of the points that he makes in the film, to Batman about humans, about how they're pushed to the brink, how they act. Again, I don't necessarily agree with all that he says, but I always have a sense of what he stands for. You could even say that he has an ideology of sorts, because he ends up burning a pile of money at one point in the movie. What does Moriarty believe in Sherlock?
Why are you doing all of this?
It's so funny.
You don't want money or power, not really. What is it all for?
I want to solve the problem. Our problem. The final problem.
He believes that Sherlock is a genius like himself, and that therefore they are destined to always be together. He believes that people are inherently average and that they will turn against you very easily. Okay, so we kind of see that when people start to turn against Sherlock after he's framed by Moriarty, but again, the show never sticks with that. Apart from that, I would say that Moriarty doesn't really have strong motivation. He kind of just does whatever will surprise the audience in the moment.
Sorry, boys! I'm so changeable. It is a weakness with me, but to be fair to myself, it is my only weakness.
I think that we've moved away from this kind of villain now, and I don't really mind, because to be honest with you, I think it peaked with The Dark Knight. I think that Javier Bardem has played some very good villains, but Raul Silva definitely wasn't one of them. Andrew Scott has played some good villains and anti-heroes. I really enjoyed his performance in Ripley. I think that when he has good material to work with, he can play a very good villain. But I think that he was just misused in Sherlock. I think that he was kind of just given no direction whatsoever and just told to do whatever he liked.
We had to audition someone to play Moriarty without ever having written a scene for him. So we rustled up a ridiculous scene, a really ridiculous scene. We should sort of think, if anyone could play this, with ridiculous lines like, "I will burn the heart out of you."
I will burn the heart out of you.
Hope you enjoyed this retrospective. It was kind of more informal, but I really enjoyed breaking down my feelings on this. Thank you guys for watching. Let me know in the comments whether you think that Heath Ledger's performance was really as iconic as it was made out to be, or whether you thought that Moriarty actually worked.
Moriarty is the first supervillain, and therefore has become the pattern, and therefore, like all these things, has become a bit of a cliche. So we knew we had to go somewhere else.